But I'd like to welcome you all today and thank you for joining us for the first session in a series of workshops for our AHRC-funded GenViR network project being led by Nadia Svirydzenka. And today's session will focus on the context of gender-based violence in India. And we have three very exciting speakers today, very creative speakers who will be sharing plenty of things with us today. In terms of the format, then, the objective of the session really is to stimulate discussion around the topic. So we're trying to be as sort of less prescriptive as possible, less kind of rigid, but we're wanting to ensure that there's ample time and space for questions, comments, discussions after each of the presentations. So each speaker will present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and there will be an immediate opportunity to have to ask questions, have discussions about things. We'll also have a kind of a summative sort of Q&A at the end of the workshop as well. I'll invite the speakers to share some final comments at the end of the session with their reflections, and I hope that we can continue the discussions at that point. Please, at any point, if you would like to add any questions or any comments, please make sure that you put them into the chat box while the speakers are talking as well. The chat will be monitored, and I will be picking those up. So just to introduce everybody then, and I'll be introducing the speakers in the order that they will be presenting today. We start with Dr. Nadia Svirydzenka. Nadia is an associate professor and reader in culture, identity and mental health at Montfort University, and she's also the deputy director of the Mary C. Cole Research Centre. Nadia is a social and cultural psychologist, and her research interests lie in understanding mental health of vulnerable populations through culturally framed identities, attitudes, stigma and behaviours. She's passionate about transdisciplinary research, and in her projects, she blends the use of creative methodology with traditional mixed methods to elicit new stories and lived experiences and to catalyse fresh thinking about possible solutions. She's part of a number of UKRI-funded projects, including Champions, which was an ESRC rapid response study exploring the impact of temporary accommodation and homelessness on health and development of young children in the UK. She's also currently leading this AHRC-funded network project between the UK and India on gender-based violence and resilience on internal migrant women and the Hijra community. Our second speaker is Shruthi Venkatchalam. She's a doctoral researcher at the Centre for Gender and Violence Research at the School of Policy Studies, University of Bristol. She obtained her MPhil and master's degrees in social work, specialising in criminology and justice from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Her research primarily revolves around comprehending various manifestations of violence in the lives of disabled women, with a particular focus on theories of justice, intersectionality in practice, critical disability theory, and feminist approaches to research methods. Additionally, she serves as a practitioner coach for value-based leadership training and conducts training sessions on disability rights and sexual education for women and girls with disabilities. She has collaborated with RTL Academy in the development of training module on disability and disaster risk reduction, with a particular focus on children and adults with disabilities. And last but certainly not least is Professor Raghavan. Professor Raghavan holds a chair in mental health at De Montfort University. He is the director of the Mary C. Cole Research Centre, an interdisciplinary research institute focusing on mental health, migration, ethnicity and culture, and is also the director of the Lifelong Learning Wellbeing research theme. He is also the co-director of the Leicester Centre for Mental Health Research, a collaborative research centre with De Montfort University, Leicester Partnerships NHS Trust, and the University of Leicester. He has extensive experience of interdisciplinary research methodology using creative arts-based approaches for co-creating knowledge of lived expertise and cultural mental health perspectives from urban and rural communities. He holds a number of UKRI Research and Innovation and National Institute of Health Research UK research grants, and has published widely with over 140 publications on the theme of mental health and disability of diverse cultural communities in India and the UK. He's presented his work on resilience and forced displacement to the Overseas Development Committee at the UK Houses of Parliament, and is currently a trustee of the Me Help India Foundation, an NGO working in urban and rural India, promoting culturally appropriate mental health literacy. Okay, thank you very much to our speakers for their time today. I'm going to start with Nadia. Nadia, if you'd be able to share your presentation slides with all of us, that'd be great.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for joining us on this talk and on these workshops. I will particularly be talking about the link between gender-based violence and looking at it through the cultural lens, understanding culture, how we research culture, particularly in relation to social and meaningful constructs like mental health, like gender-based violence, is my area of expertise and interest. So if we're looking at culture and understanding what culture is, so I'll start very standard with a definition. So this is a definition of culture provided by UNESCO, where culture is the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or a social group. It includes not only arts and letters, but also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value system, traditions, and beliefs. So when I'm talking about culture, from my perspective, when we're researching the importance of culture, we're looking at it from that kind of complex perspective of where there's an intersectionality between kind of material culture, spiritual culture, behavioral, with impact on livelihoods of individuals and groups. And within this kind of encompassing understanding and complex understanding of culture, gender identities and gender relations are very much critical aspects of that, and they're shaped by culture in terms of how they are constructed, how they relate to each other, and how people experience daily life within the family, but also wider society, wider community in their workplaces. So you're seeing yourself, for example, as a woman within society, but how I function, what is available to me, what I can and cannot do, what are my boundaries, what are my opportunities, what are my vulnerabilities, are very much defined within that cultural framework. And therefore, culture defines the spaces within which power is expressed and gender roles are enshrined. So there's very much an element of power and negotiating power within the spaces of family, community, and society that come with sort of that, the power imbalance between different genders and different gender identities. So the culture of gender-based violence is this particular looking at the kind of cultural values or environments that might facilitate or promote or sustain gender-based violence within their contexts. Things like devaluing women, girls, and LGBT individuals within the context, normalizing or minimizing abuse, claiming GBV is accidental, ignoring sexism, promoting aggressive or even toxic masculinity, as well as using men's achievements to exonerate, excuse, and deny the impact of their behavior. So again, looking at GBV, particularly with a wider societal and social violence in a way, in terms of structures, in terms of power dynamics, in terms of pathways for combating that, for example, rather than just looking at violence in terms of kind of interpersonal domestic violence, etc., but looking at it in a kind of wider context. And these patterns of behavior, these rules, these regulations, these power imbalances, system perpetuates them really. Looking at policing, so prescribing and maintaining traditional gender norms, defining transgressions within the cultural context, patrolling the boundaries, and that people stay within their boundaries very much, and enforcing compliance to those boundaries through violence, coercion, pressure, rejection from the community or from family. It can precipitate all the way into kind of the systems within particular cultural contexts, be it legal, economic, or political system, whether you can report instances of gender-based violence, what is recognized as a punishable offense, what do you need to go through to do that? Will the process be re-traumatizing? And a lot of times, yes, it is. And also moderating perception. So how gender violence is viewed. Again, is it minimized by society? Is it justified because of the stigma certain genders might experience, certain identities might be experiencing in context? Some research looks at the types of cultures that might be more prone to violence and might explain particular types of violence, and calls them cultures of honor. That is not to say that GBV doesn't happen outside those contexts, but because the focus is on India, it does fall within that category. And research, fantastic research by Yvette van Osch, looks at kind of the psychological function of honor within those cultures. And honor itself is universal. We will find every culture that has something to do with honor. What is honor? How is it maintained? The value of honor within society, within family, within community. Those are very important. But when we're looking at specific cultural contexts, considerations around which conduct is considered appropriate, those kinds of patterns of behavior, saliency of honor in the culture is also varied. You know, how geared are you towards maintaining that honor? Is that not very important? Universal cases such as rape, murder, pedophilia, those are considered universally kind of taboo spaces and topics. However, for example, with adultery, with premarital intercourse, homosexuality, those constructs and those things become varied depending which culture you're going into, what consequences people face for them, for example. So what works in a specific context and group? And it's very much the psychology of functioning and kind of breaking those boundaries that allowed you within a particular culture, very much stem from our need to belong, a fundamental need of human beings to belong. We belong in our groups that come with norms and regulations, as we said, that govern our gender identities and gender relations. And any actual or perceived moral deviance, be it getting a job, getting an education, marrying a particular person or outside of the allowed boundaries, can lead to exclusion and stigmatization of that person. And not only them, but their associate individuals as well, their children, their family members, etc., will face the consequences of breaking those boundaries, with psychological outcomes of lower self-esteem, belonging, lowered control and meaning in life. And Raghu later will be talking about kind of the mental health aspects of things. So there's going to be a lot of push towards restoring that honor. So going back into your boundaries or ostracizing individuals from the communities that refuse to do so. So it's all negotiation within the community around gender and around those kinds of prescriptive patterns of behavior or roles. In our work in GenViR, what we were able to do is connect with some communities in India and ask them what makes them strong in face of their gender identities and the context that they find themselves in. Because how people negotiate those spaces, negotiate their identities, are very specific to them and their context. We spoke to some representatives of the Hijra community in Pune that said our strength comes from need. We need to be strong, therefore we are strong. But they highlighted the role of community for their resilience. They were ostracized from their families, from their communities, because of their identity, but they had found kind of new families, new connections within the community of other Hijras that share information, share resources and support. So that kind of reconstructed belonging in a different space is their source of strength and resilience. And the creative practice is a way of transcending limited opportunities and those stigmas within systems of legality of employment and education. It allows them to transcend that for livelihood and dignity. We also spoke to women who were internal migrants in Pune who lived in the slum contexts. And it was an interesting conversation because for them, yes, strength also came from determination. You're determined to be strong and you have to. But also negotiating a space within a community was quite different. because they had to negotiate stigma of, for example, widowhood, and what was prescribed when your identity as a woman was transformed because you no longer had a man with you. And understanding how does that happen, and then you're policed by your own community. So the role of community for those two identities becomes very, very different when you're talking about kind of violence and overcoming, being resilient to violence. Now, if we want to create change, and again, this is a kind of a part reflection kind of talk and discussion, and I'd really welcome feedback from you all and questions and just comments. So if we are to create change, if we want to stop that, we want to prevent that, that's what a lot of the research is aiming for, right? We want to make it applied. We want to create positive change in society. It can happen. It can happen from internal changes, economy, government changes, technology advancements, ecology changes, some cataclysms that allow pathways, for example, for women to the workplace. So some trade policies in Bangladesh have reconstructed notion of purdah, or female seclusion, where women in a workplace have kind of crossed that cultural notion and those boundaries. Push from civil society as well is one of the ways in which you can put pressure on more legal changes, for example, or policy changes around education for girls, women's access to paid work, public attitudes to domestic violence, particularly with some of our partners working in Pune have demonstrated that life skills for girls can prevent, early marriage for them. And also intercultural contact. So you're creating change in a culture because of globalization, because of being exposed to different modalities, different options of living your life within your gender identity and within your community. But as I said, this is a bit of a reflection talk for me as well, because I always reflect doing this work cross-culturally on my positionality as a white female going into these spaces with my educational background and my own privilege. And a lot of this research requires us to not be culture bound or culture blind in understanding what is GBV and how is that constructed and negotiated within the spaces that we're going into. So this is a work in progress and a reflection in progress. But I think it's important to understand that even if we want to be very critical and very open, we are blind to certain aspects of things just because we don't know any different. So I just wanted to be quite transparent about that in my talk and my approach to this topic. And recognize the tension between honoring cultures and being multicultural. So facilitating representation in spaces that cultures deserve. And also some feminist arguments about the empowerment of women, for example, and overcoming patriarchal structures. So being very critical of culture being used as a justification for GBV. These things happen because that's in their culture and therefore they should be left alone. So again, thinking about creating that impact from that positionality, which I would challenge. I would problematize the concept of core cultural practice that is always used as a defense of certain cultural traditions. Oh, it's a tradition, it's a cultural practice, therefore it should be maintained. Which sometimes traditionally can be disadvantageous to women and LGBTQI+ individuals and identities. To which I would ask, are they the norm of the entire cultural group? It's hardly, I would probably say a lot of women hardly would agree that, it's our culture, it's our norm to have forced marriage. The norm might be arranged marriage, but forced marriage is something different. So again, it's those positions of power that dictate what is the core structure, and being critical in terms of who subscribes to that and who does it benefit. So again, being quite careful with this notion. So where can we intervene? Again, let's kind of doing the interventions, thinking about research in those contexts. What is the legitimacy of interventions against GBV? Do we, to some extent, impose our notions of disadvantage from my identity, my experience, my position of privilege onto other contexts. And again, being very reflective and critical operating in those spaces. So in not combating or not be challenging the agency of individuals. So for example, and as an image here, the France ban on head covering to women, where that was quite opposed by the cultural groups within the context. So how do we do it meaningfully? How do we not come across as bulls in the china shop doing this work in context? Working in critical methodologies help, looking at feminist, emancipatory, and participatory work, working with organizations, with cultural groups that already work in those spaces, partnering with them because they will know the local context. Working in ways that will create space to learn, hear voices, and execute agency for the participants. And asking pragmatic policy questions, looking at legislation, education, advocacy groups, whatever is acceptable within the context that you're going into. And interestingly, a workshop series was organized particularly around those kinds of considerations. So we will be talking about all of those things. And thank you very much. I'll stop here for your time and for paying attention to my talk.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for that. That was really, really insightful. I want to open the floor to any comments, questions. They don't have to be questions at all. They can be just feedback. I think just picking up on one of Nadia's points around this focus on change. Where does that change making? Where should it be rooted? Where do we need to focus our efforts on? So anybody from the space who wants to come in? Deepika, I see you've unmuted yourself. Come on in.
Hi, I'm Deepika. I'm studying MSc Clinical Psychology in Swansea University.
Great.
Thank you so much for the talk, Nadia. It was very nice. I had one question-ish. I'm not sure if it really qualifies as a question. So while we were talking about gendered roles in the initial slides, so for example, I have been born in India. I've been raised in India for most of my life. And so both my parents are working, but I see my mother doing most of the cooking and, taking care of us and everything. So it's kind of inculcated in us, but like through our education and everything, we understand that, okay, that's not correct. Both the partners need to, be involved. However, whenever, there is something that, I don't know, is there a biological innateness in women, for example, to, to take care or do something, or is it just the gendered roles and the culture that has made us like this?
Oh, we're not going to finish this. The fundamental discussion, is it, our evolution that made us this way, or is it our social roles? I think the jury's still out. My argument would be that we're very much socialized into. That would be my argument. So because these patterns do change with different upbringing, with different education, etc. And I think it's having that choice to do that. I think a lot of times you grow up in that kind of mentality that's your boundary. It's invisible and we self-regulate. It's like an internalized, process that we're not aware that we're doing that. So that would be my argument. I don't know if Brown might be raising a hand to disagree. So I'll give him a chance to input here as well.
No, just to say that you don't have to look very far at the broad sweep of history or the buffet of human cultures to find other examples. For example, here in the United Kingdom and Northern Europe and North America, there was a time when men took care of people in a kind of nurturing sort of way and healed the sick, especially medieval monks. In the 19th century, it was Florence Nightingale who was the guilty party, in a sense. She feminized nursing. Men's hard and horny hands are unsuitable for caring work, no matter how gentle their hearts might be, as she was said to say. And also we noticed that some aspects of society have changed quite rapidly. Just within my lifetime, the number of young women finding their way into universities, finding their way even into traditional male-dominated fields like accountancy and medicine. Not so much engineering, but many other places. It's changed out of all recognition. And yet, when you look at studies of housework and childcare, back in the home, things are often much more gender stereotyped, with women tending to take the majority share of housework and childcare. So some people, like Hostel, talk about the second shift. You've been out conquering the world all day, and then you've kind of got to go home and get the children their tea and listen to them read and make sure they do their homework and put them to bed. You can get men interested in needlecraft. For example, if it's high-end tailoring and they get lots of prestige and money for it, you can get men interested in cooking if it's high-end prestige stuff and you get a Michelin star for it in a TV series. It's the less glamorous stuff. Looking after children in most societies has not been a terribly high status occupation. In cultures that practice slavery, it's usually the slave's job. Sorry, I'll shut up on that point, but there's complex intersections of hierarchy, remuneration, and prestige attached to many of these activities.
Great, thank you, Brown, for that. And thank you, Deepika, for that question. Great question. Anybody
Hi,
else?
can
yes,
I?
Lippy.
Can
yes,
I?
of
Yeah,
course.
hi. So thank you. That was such an amazing presentation, and you hit on so many important points. I'm particularly interested in discussing a little bit very quickly about what you said about challenging core cultural norms, because that is so important, and that was so validating to hear you say that. The challenge, because I have been doing this, I've been trying to do this, is of course respecting people's agency. But I just wanted to add here that sometimes, you want to respect the agency of the person, and that's really important. But the agency that they currently have may not be an informed agency. I'm just not probably using the right term here, but if you can get a gist of what I mean by that, it's a lot of the times, the women really don't know better because they have been told that this is cultural and therefore it's okay. So they really have no idea that their rights are being violated within that context. So I know that there's not enough time to go into deep discussions about this today, but I would love to speak about this at some time with any of you and get your further thoughts on that.
Absolutely, I think that's such an important point.
Yes.
Very briefly, systems are very, very creative in sustaining the status quo. And I think that is so, and you see that not only with the GBV and gender context and everything else, you can see it with, any kind of power structures. They kind of like a hydra, you cut a head off and then the other one goes and everything else, just because, it works for them. If the people in power, they don't necessarily want to share.
Absolutely.
And so I think it is a very, very challenging thing. And I think this is where literacy comes across, quite importantly, in terms of kind of going through education, going through kind of those systems where people have access to it and having that information out there. But also, how do you give that information in a not dominating and, way, which is why creative ways of, exploring these topics and everything else works so well, because they're not patronizing. Because the last thing you need is, come in and say, this is the right way.
Absolutely.
And that has very kind of a very colonial sense to it. So
yes. Well, I work with my own. I work with clients all over the world, but I work a lot with clients here in India, and so for me, it's not the colonial issue, but it can still come across as patronizing, because there's like, oh, you're the psychologist. Oh, you're going to tell us what to do. So you don't want to get into that space.
Absolutely. We have Rashi as well. Raised your hand. Rashi, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Lippy's point and your point. I think we began with the idea of looking at gender as a social construct, but also agency as a very socio-cultural construct. That even when people are trying to bring in their ideas of, this is what we want and this is how we are looking at, can we really look at the different layers of that in a socio-cultural context? So when we look at autonomy, are we looking at absolute freedom, or are we looking at more of it in terms of embeddedness? Not only in terms of how they're being socialized, but also the embeddedness of that autonomy to achieve survival, to achieve resilience. I think those were the points that we were been discussing for a long time. We just thought we can, put that out. And the dangers of that being that sometimes when we look at agency or when we look at autonomy from a social cultural perspective, we may find it difficult to really bring it to a much more generic or a generalized format to apply it elsewhere or to look for an exchange in a more global sense. So that's my reflection. Thank you.
Thank you.
Haj.
Hello, nice to see you all. Thank you. Yeah, great presentation. It's really good that we're looking at the cultural aspect of it. But I share the socialization aspect because I think within the Sikh community as well, as Anoop will know, we have this issue where equality is quite embedded within the religion, something that's coming out of my work, my own PhD, which is on Sikh domestic abuse and mental health impact. So very much share that really, given there's an emphasis on equality part of the religion, which is also important to them, there is still this kind of inequality that females sort of undergo globally really within that unit, and that's what I find quite difficult really. I think it should be equality based, and it's not being, and that's how culturally problematic gender socialization is, where even though it says explicitly in a religious doctrine that it should be equality based, it's not quite happening, and girls are still being disadvantaged, although admittedly they are excelling in education, but the family environment still has an expectation of the doing majority of the housework. So we're quite behind a bit still. We're still doing the triple shift within those cultures. So yeah, just wanted to add that in. Thank you.
Great. I think that would be a good time to maybe shift across to our next presentation. Nadia, did you want to add anything onto that?
No, I think for the conscious of time, so if we can have a general discussion at the end, I think that'll be quite nice to bring it all together. Yeah.
Fantastic. Shruthi, do you want to load up your presentation?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you. And again, if anybody has any points to make, I mean, it's great that everybody's wanting to talk. I love that. But if anybody does want to type and is unable to sort of come on audio or anything like that, please feel free to type your comments in the chat box.
Nadia and Anoop for inviting me today to share my talk. And thank you so much, Nadia, for your presentation, because you have really set the ground in terms of talking about cultural and social context in India. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, I would like to begin my presentation by sharing my positionality. I'm a woman with vision disability and a survivor of violence. So today's presentation would be like partly reflection of my own insider identity, and also based on my research evidence. I've been working on violence against disabled women for nearly a decade. I started my project in 2014, where I looked at the experiences of disabled women, survivors of rape with the criminal justice system. So the findings of my research highlighted that disabled women had to experience a lot of struggles, stereotypes, and the subjection of secondary victimization within the criminal justice agency was very high. Another interesting finding from my research highlighted that in terms of understanding justice, the survivors of violence in majority cases do not align with the legal justice system, and their experience and their understanding of justice was completely different to the legal understanding. Next slide. So to take that finding and to investigate more into that, my current research looks at various forms of violence experienced by disabled women and their perspectives on justice. So I'm particularly looking at the alternative understanding of justice from the survivors' understanding. So using a feminist approach, I did conduct interviews with survivors of violence. Like I did interviews with almost like 18 disabled women. And I was particularly interested in looking at the relationship between intersectionality, the manifestation of power, and the socioeconomic capital that greatly influences the experience of violence. So for better understanding of different levels of, to have a better understanding of the experiences of violence, and also to understand the challenges at different levels. So I have divided into 3 levels: the individual factors, family and community factors, and the larger systemic challenges. Next slide. Yeah, so at an individual factors, when we look, sorry, my screen reader started speaking, I had to pause. Yeah, in order to understand the experiences of violence at an individual level, often we need to have an understanding of the intersectionality that the women belong to, because the intersectional factors do provide space for privileges and as well as disadvantages. And for example, like when I interviewed women, survivors of violence, survivors of violence, women did belong, because I was particularly looking at women from various backgrounds. So my participants did include women from various settings, like urban and also rural settings, and also from different caste, class, religion, education status, and age groups. So I couldn't get hold of anyone from various sexual identity. So that was quite challenging for me to access and do interviews. So, but I did look at the other factors. So what I understood based on the interviews with the women was their intersectional status do provide a space of, it does bestows them with some privileges and some disadvantages, but the manifestation of power in terms of like social, economic, and cultural power within those spaces has a significant influence on how women exercise their agency. For example, the social construction of gender and other identities. The social construction of gender and other identities often other identities develops a sense of internalized oppression among women. And even if they do have, like, for example, even if the woman belongs to a economically stronger background, still she finds it difficult to challenge some of the patriarchal power and power structures, because she from the childhood she has been grown up hearing that women women are comparatively like women have to comply with the patriarchal structure, and especially when a woman enters a marital relationship, she has to make sure that she upholds her relationship, because again, marriage is something which is assigned to the honor and status quo of the family. So even if she has certain privileges, but still she doesn't have that space to exercise her agency and challenge the power structures. And so when we look at the domestic violence, especially in India, often the perpetrators are not only the partners, it also includes other family members. And when the woman tries to leave the abusive relationship, she gets there are lots of barriers. For example, the kind of relationship that she holds with the perpetrator, and my since my research was, I looked at the experiences of violence in the lives of disabled women. My finding did also highlighted that women, disabled women particularly, they experience violence not only in their marital homes, but they also experienced violence within the natal homes, whereas the family and the siblings were controlling and often the disabled women had to challenge or had to struggle with their perpetrators, because there is an element of dependency on the perpetrators for financial need, for financial support or even other support, because in India we because I'm a bit I'm being mindful of generalizing the situation, because my research was based out of Tamil Nadu, which counts only one part of state in the whole country. So I cannot generalize, but still it does provide us with a significant view of looking at the issue. So we do not have adequate support system provided by the state to end or lead the abusive relationship. So those are the challenges that a woman, a particularly disabled woman, face when in leaving the abusive relationship. Next slide. Yeah. So at a family and community level factors, often the belief system within the family in terms of the religion and the cultural practices prevents disabled women or even other women in general to leave their abusive relationship. So I discussed I already did talk about how because the Indian families often assign honor as an element to marital relationship. So if a woman leaves the marital home, it is considered as a bad sign, and families do not often agree to that, and often they do not provide support. And also in terms of the community and local services, as I said, we don't have adequate support services, especially in rural areas. Still, in Tamil Nadu, I'm talking. So there is a practice of panchayat system. So where women, a panchayat is a panchayat system at the village level is where the dominant, the male leaders in most of the cases, the male members of the village from dominant caste and class, they come together and they try to resolve the issues that occurs within the village. So what happens is, especially in the case of family disputes, when a woman approaches, a woman is supposed to approach the panchayat because she cannot go and directly file a complaint. And when she approaches the panchayat, so the results is often patriarchal. So often the members of the panchayat, they do support the patriarchal behavior, and often the struggles and the violence endured by the women is considered as less significant, and it is normalized in many of the in many instances. For example, in one of my participant woman, she shared that just because her family and the woman, when she decided to complain against her husband, who was abusing her physically and emotionally, when she approached the police station surpassing the panchayat, like one thing she struggled so much to kind of get her complaint registered with the police, because she was coming from a low socioeconomic background. And also the woman and her family was forced to leave the village because she surpassed the panchayat and she filed a complaint. So in such instances, the woman and the family is forced to leave their livelihood and all their resources behind, and they are and now like the woman is still they are not able to they're struggling to go back to their village and resume their life. So, and also in terms of other services at community level, in terms of healthcare system, so often violence is considered as something private, and often the healthcare professionals do not talk about even if they notice that there are like signs of violence, particularly among the female patients. They are reluctant to talk to have a conversation about that, and they are not trained to address or help or support the women who come there for the medical support. Yeah, next. So yeah. Okay, so at systemic challenges, I would like to highlight the barriers and the challenges that women face, starting from accessing the various statutory support. For example, like filing a complaint with the police is such a struggle. And often, though we do have like female women's police station across the state and also in other like states within India, but the research evidence highlight that even the women police, they become the promoters of patriarchal like values and traditions, and also like in the absence of support services, they often the survivors are told to kind of compromise and live with their abusive like relationships, and yeah, so struggles in filing the complaint, and often like women are so this these are some of the findings that my research based on based on the narratives from disabled women highlighted that often they do not I mean the police often ask through insensitive questions while giving testimony, and they don't have any accessible, there is absence of accessible and affordable shelters for the women to like if they are leaving the abusive relationship, and often like in the event of like women having children, in most of the cases, the women tend to choose to live with their abusive partners, mainly for the keeping in mind the child's well-being, and also due to the lack of financial like support. Yeah. Next slide. So these are some of the action these are some of the action points that I would like to highlight based on my research. So another big issue that we that we have in India is absence of disaggregated data on violence against women. We do have data, but in most of the cases, there is no proper recording of data, and also in terms of when it comes to disability and other marginalized identities, like we don't have specific data on violence against disabled women or violence against Dalit women and things like that. So we need data for we need to we need data to work towards prevention, and also to and also to come up with interventions. And other aspects includes like advocating for inclusive policies, inclusive policy services, and also implementation, because we do have comprehensive legislation on like violence against women, but most of the times the problem lies with the implementation. And especially in with regards to my research, only in 2013, disability was included within the criminal offense, like crime against women. And since then, but even now, there is no adequate training or awareness among the like criminal justice agencies, like because most of the times the police are not aware in terms of the protocol to be followed in terms of investigating survivors who have disability. So we need to have more training among law enforcement agencies, criminal justice system, and other service providers to also cater to diverse cultural needs of women survivors. And last thing is, we do have many like human rights movements, but there is lack of understanding and lack of collaboration between the feminist movements and other human rights movements, like those who work on caste and things like that. So it is, so for example, when there is a violence against women, it is often kind of, especially if the woman has multiple identities, multiple intersecting identities, she feels nowhere. She doesn't have a she feels that she belongs nowhere because her experience is unique and it is complex, and the work that we have been doing the work that has been that we are doing against discrimination and exclusion, we don't often include those. So I think I would stop my presentation. There is so much to talk, and I think I was able to present one side of the issue. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shruthi. That was a really insightful presentation, and lots of food for thought, and lots of things that you've touched upon that you're absolutely right require maybe lots more discussion going forward. I'd like to open the floor to any questions first, please. Harj, did you want to come in with your question at all?
Sorry, I think it might have been answered by the in the chat, but really insightful presentation again. I think, as always, perpetrators will use anything that they can to target the survivor or victim at the time. So yeah, definitely, I think disabilities has not been researched as much as it could have been, and mental health has in terms of stigma, but not so much disability. So that's good to see. So yeah, my main question was the panchayat. Really, it seems like it's a really influential thing. You know, the community gets involved, but and my question was really around it. Is it mainly male? And Lippy's answered it with that they are mostly males, but changes around the female panchayat are becoming more common. So yeah, I just had a question about that really, because I don't know much about panchayats, and wondered if they can be mobilised in any way to help with this, if the police are not as helpful and the legislation is letting survivors down.
Yeah, in terms of, based on my research and my interviews with the women, what I understood, it is mostly male, the panchayat leaders. But now there is this program called Nari Adalats, which is being practiced in other states, like for example, Gujarat, Karnataka, where women a group of women, they constitute, Nari Adalats are mainly practiced within the rural areas. So a group of women from various backgrounds, they come together. So they form a committee, and mostly like any domestic or family related issues get settled within the Nari Adalat. So it is partly funded by the government, but it is not. There are stories around Nari Adalats where many women find it a safe space because it consists of, because the committee is constituted by women. And there are mixed stories coming up, but women at present, given the current situation where there are more male dominance, I think Nari Adalat is being welcomed by women in rural areas. But again, we need to have more research on that.
Thank you. Benita, you had a question as well, didn't you?
It's not really a question, just a thought that was coming in, because based on the comment there also, that just understanding disability also is that there is so much stigma around the idea of disability and lack of awareness around it. And then if we add to it GBV, it just is so much more complex. And I think the empowerment goes both ways, and mobilizing resources for the community goes both ways. And for instance, I think in terms of what Shruthi mentioned in terms of Nari Adalats, there are also tribal communities where women are very, very empowered, running women's leadership collectives and supporting each other. But there are these complex layers of having children, for instance, who are girl childs and are disabled, for the lack of a better word, they through some disabilities or special needs, and there is so much stigma towards the child. And in trying to protect the child, and the woman is stigmatized, and then there's a whole layer of cycle and a whole layer of other oppressions that come in the way. And like for instance, this happens in Kerala quite a bit with even though there is a lot of matriarchy, not so much patriarchy, traditionally speaking, but there is so much that goes in the control, or there's so much power for men when the child or especially female children are not accepted for their special needs and challenges. So I just thought it was very complex and interesting as we're talking about women voices coming into panchayats or in other government policies. There's this, it's like a double-edged sword. Where how does that kind of fit in to the larger context, and also women supporting other women coming with their own traumas, and how that kind of gets difficult to separate, right? Even if we look at the chain of who's supporting whom, even if experiences are similar, what does that look like? So just a thought, not a question.
Yeah, it's very true, because when I was looking at, when I was analyzing the experiences of violence and the way in which disabled women are reacting to their experiences of violence, it was very apparent. Because on one side, as you said, the social construction of disability often puts women at a lower pedestal. On top of it, when disability adds to it, it becomes like you completely, like, even if you want to, it completely robs the agency from the women. And there is a very strong internalized oppression that the women kind of assumes, where she thinks that she can't complain. And especially when in India, getting married for a disabled woman is being spoken as a boon, because nobody wants to get married to a disabled. And when a disabled woman gets married, on top of it, she has nothing to complain. She should not complain, and she should not talk about her experiences of domestic violence. So yeah, it's very
Thank
complex.
you. Brown, you have a question or a point to make?
Hold on, just to unmute myself there. When we've been to India with some of our research projects, we have seen initiatives going on. For example, in Kerala, we saw, I think you were with me, Nadia, we saw that pink police car, if you remember that, in lurid Barbie pink, and we wondered if it was a real one for a moment or two. But then we realised that it was part of an initiative to, encourage women to trust the police and come forward and so on. Are these sorts of initiatives making any headway? What else could be done to make these kinds of things more effective, do you think?
Sorry, you're asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you
okay.
or anybody else.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because again, like in terms of Tamil Nadu, we have like a women's police station in most of the like districts, because the mainly these police, these women's police stations were set up mainly for the women to feel safe and to come forward and make a complaint. But again, I think because in India, the patriarchal behavior cannot be relegated only among males, because there are also so many female, so many women who endorse and who practice patriarchy. So in that sense, I think it's very complex, because we often say, okay, we need to have more training, but just with the training, I think it's very difficult to kind of address the attitudes, because even I've been thinking on that, like how do you deal with the attitude? Because more than the practice, it's something that is so ingrained among people. So yeah, so anybody else can.
Yeah, Shruthi, I back you up on that completely. By the way, wonderful presentation. Thank you. And you made such powerful points, important points. But, I completely back up what you're saying about even the women being so patriarchal and reinforcing the patriarchy, that even when you have female police officers or the pink boots or the pink cars, there is a very high chance that you will be at the best shamed, because a lot of the kind of violence, especially the most subtler forms of violence, are so normalized. So they sort of fly under the radar. And then in the worst case scenario, completely dismissed even by a female officer, because they are, they are sort of a very, very, I call them the foot soldiers of the patriarchy. A lot of Indian women and officers are foot soldiers for the patriarchy.
On that note, I think that's a good point to pause maybe this discussion so we can move on to Professor Raghavan's presentation. I'm sure there's lots and lots more to talk about. I think we'll do that as a big discussion towards the end. So Raghu, would you be okay to share your presentation with the group, please?
Nadia is sharing that.
Nadia.
Yes, I am.
Radio. Okay. Thank you very much, Nadia and crowd, for asking me to do a very short presentation on the mental health aspects of GBV. So I wasn't quite sure where to start, in terms of the mental health consequences, because it is not a straightforward context at all. So anyway, also I'll put things in context. A lot of things that both Nadia and Shruthi spoke about, are sort of feeding into this context of actually how we support people. I wouldn't say the mental health diagnosis is not the apt thing here, but I think we need to look at how we support, help and support women and men as well. I must also speak up for men too, in relation to who are at the end of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. Right, so this is obviously, we know people mentioned about the complexity of the situation here. It is a serious violation of human rights, and it's actually that is the context of that is, it sort of affects one's health in the broader sense of the word, not just the mental health context. There are health issues and mental health issues and protection issues here. And again, there are women, girls, and boys who fall victim to violence simply because of their gender, and they are especially at risk because they are not sure what is actually happening in their life and what is actually happening around them. It feels very much trapped in that kind of context, and I think that is important to remember why somebody is actually behaving in such a way. So we also know that 1 in 3 women will experience sexual and physical violence in their lifetime from the UN data sets. And also GBV includes the sexual, physical, mental, and economic harm inflicted either in public or in private. Also, it includes threats of violence, coercion, and manipulation as well. So it also takes many forms, which such as the intimate partner violence, and which has been talked about, and sexual violence, and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation, and the so-called honor crimes as well. And recently, over the last few years, the advent of social media, the cyber violence against women is also rising and spreading, especially with young women who are users of social media are disproportionately affected here. Next slide, please. So some of the shocking facts of GBV, I think to put that in context, I know this is pretty shocking, but I think you need to understand this from the for the mental health and well-being perspective. So 1 in 3 women worldwide experience physical and sexual violence in their lifetime. Globally, as many as 38% of women, murders of women are committed by male partners. About 200 million women and girls have experienced female genital mutilation. And each year, they say that 15 million girls are married before the age of 18. That is 28 girls every minute. It is estimated that about 10 million children are victims of child exploitation. And school-related gender GBVs means that 1 in 4 girls say that they are uncomfortable to use the school toilets. And between 80 and 100 million girls are actually missing from the world's population because of a number of issues that they actually experience. And as many as 1 in 4 women experience physical and or sexual violence during pregnancy. Next slide, please. So about 150 million girls worldwide are raped or subject to sexual violence every year, usually by someone in their family circle. And about 700 million women alive today were married as children. And there are about 5,000 or so honor killings reported every year. And experts actually estimate that the actual number of honor killings could be much higher. And 30% of females globally have reported that their first sexual experience was within this context. And 8% of new HIV infections among young persons is actually a result of the GBV context, also the rape context, and violence or threat of violence affect the ability of older and young women to protect themselves from HIV. Domestic violence is a global problem, and we also know that from our own work in the Pune context. It's a major issue from migrant slum-dwelling communities. And globally, around 137 women are actually killed by their partners or family members every day. And women between the ages of 15 and 44 are at higher risk of rape or violence than cancer, car accidents, malaria, or being injured in war. So that is a context that in which we talk about the GBV, the complexity of it, the gravity of all those things actually happening. It is not simple in relation to how we look at it purely from a man and woman perspective, but I think the wider social, cultural, economic, political, and psychological and well-being and health context as well. Next slide, please. So what actually happens, we, both Nadia, myself, and Anup had the opportunity to talk to a group of women in Pune recently, and I was sort of very looked at there's a tragic element of actually being trapped in a context of GBV in some respects, but there is also if we actually give the necessary encouragement, necessary opportunities for women to actually try and overcome some of those things, the resilience angle of how one is actually able to see the other side through raising their own strength, and how collectively that could be actually done. Next slide, please. So in terms of the mental health angle, women and girls is a high risk factor for poor health outcomes, including poor mental health, and adverse reproductive outcomes, and social health, and disability, chronic pain and brain injury and death can also happen as a result of the GBV context. In India, women and girls with multiple intersecting socioeconomic vulnerabilities, the poorest are those from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, and those with the limited education are actually at greater risk of GBV. And we do know that migrant slum-dwelling women and their children are disproportionately affected by a variety of risks arising from their migration from rural to urban areas and cities. And religion, caste, customs, family dynamics, regressive gender norms, and cultural norms of masculinity put Indian women in a subservient and exploitable position in many domains of life. Some of those discussions have already taken place. Women are often unaware of their rights, especially, and if they are aware of them, they are not. It is not easy to work through the system of criminal justice or other formal mechanisms to actually address, and it remains very ineffective in the Indian context. It also remains ineffective in the UK too, but people don't talk about it. Next slide, please. Some of the consequences of GBV, the incidents of sexual nature in particular, have profound long-term psychological impact on the victims. Nearly 50% of women feel anxious, and 49% actually feel vulnerable. 39% actually lose confidence, and 36% are actually depressed. So all the kind of condition-specific contexts are actually very much evident here. Also, 35% of women victims having difficulties in sleeping, and also 33% are actually experiencing panic attacks. Women who have recently experienced severe episodes of violence generally experience higher levels of distress, and distress is something that I want to focus on. I think distress, everybody actually experiences that distress, and also in terms of the trapped mode of things, that distress, how one is not actually able to express those distress, and because obviously sort of trying to sort of talk about what is actually happening in their own life, what is actually happening within the family context is the most important thing. So some of the victims actually experience high levels of psychological distress and this related system, and also it actually, as it gets later, demonstrating that enduring effects actually it sort of impacts on the intimate partner violence on mental health. Next slide, please. So in relation to the intimate partner violence, we know that research on victims of intimate partner violence, physical, psychological, and sexual, reveals that impact of abuse on the development of mental health problems. So there is a threefold increased risk of depressive disorder and fourfold increased risk of developing anxiety disorder as a result of this. And trauma, as we talked about trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the most common health problems among women victims of intimate partner violence, with risk actually increasing sevenfold as a result of the GBV experience. Next slide, please. So the risks are obviously abuse and the development of mental ill health, whatever it might be in terms of a condition, that diagnosable conditions, but there could also be the kind of wider distress that that affects everyday functioning, everyday living, everyday communication, everyday social well-being. So it leads to kind of anxiety, depression, suicide, post-traumatic stress, and also substance abuse as well. So the trauma is a major factor here. Trauma that is actually currently living through the stage of trauma, inability to experience and inability to express that trauma, and also to find help within that kind of context. So the individual perspective is very much a kind of trapped context, not able to actually try and see the light, or even if they're actually trying and see the light, the actual walls, the protective walls of society around them is making them is not enabling them to actually do that. There is also the family context. Sometimes the family itself is actually responsible for this, and the family itself, rather than providing a protective layer, it actually is actually disabling layer to some of those communities and individuals as well. So it widely impacts on the health and social well-being. That does not actually require any further explanation than that. And also because of the COVID pandemic, there has been an increase in the number of the incidences and prevalence of GBV in the Indian context and also in the Western context too. So we talked about the kind of training and awareness in the previous presentation, but I think that is a major challenge in terms of raising awareness and understanding of GBV, and how do we make other people understand about the risk of that and the experiential factors in relation to it. Next slide, please. So finally, I think kind of help and support. So GBV and mental health should be as part of the public mental health policies and activities, really, so that is people are widely aware of what is actually happening. Sometimes men don't understand what is actually happening, what is it they're actually doing, and things like that. There are states in India, such as Kerala, where there are strict regulations and laws in relation to it. So I think there are examples that could be actually followed in the Indian context. There should be protective legislations, which are already there, but implementation of those legislations in the right possible way is actually what is important. It is far more easier to actually diagnose somebody of any of these conditions with GBV than whether diagnosis is appropriate in this context is something that I wish to question, because obviously they require support. But there is a definitive pathway as to why the causative pathway here in relation to mental ill health. So I think it's the both survivors and also people who might be perpetrators as well. They require the kind of mental health awareness and support, and how that could be operationalized is something that is a big challenge. I think it's in GBV, obviously we've been talking about the kind of survivor context, and I think the strength-based approaches are actually very much important in terms of how we build in the resilience model and how we're enabling the collective conversations for sharing resilience-based solutions and confidence building for life and living is the key context here. There could be individual versions of it, there could be collective versions, that the kind of previous instance in terms of panchayats and other organizations or NGOs in India play a major role in trying to have that space where women can actually come together and raise their voices and find solutions by themselves when the agencies or the governmental bodies are not actually addressing some of those issues. Family support is a crucial thing here. I think the family should be should be having the knowledge and awareness if that is actually happening in that family, if GBV is actually happening in the family context, and how the family can effectively support that person and collectively try and actually address that for that individual. So we should actually have policy and services that support individuals and communities for the general context. I think that's what I wish to say, and I think this is a complex thing, and it's easier for me to sit down here and say that we should policy and services and support individuals and communities. But people actually experience it would be having much better way of actually how this need to be done, and that is why some of our research is actually focusing on that as to how this should be addressed. What are the solutions that survivors can actually offer in order to change those policies, in order to address those activities that is actually happening? Maybe, and I think it is something. It is a longer dialogue, longer service, longer way of actually how this thing could be impacting on the criminal justice system and also the wider health and policy context as well. But mental health, distress, and the feeling, the one that is actually subjected as to why that is actually happening to me and why I can't actually escape this is something that harms every woman. And I've seen episodes of this actually happening in the family circles, and I've often thought that why is this actually happening? It is time that we should actually stop it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raghu, for that really important and interesting overview of the context of GBV within the Indian context. I'd like to sort of invite people, I'm very conscious of time as well, but for people to sort of come in and share their thoughts, their feelings, their reflections about any of the things that they have heard, anything about their own work, their own reflections. I'd like this to sort of, we finish off on a very kind of open note of reflection, maybe thinking forward around where we move on from here. So if anybody wants to kind of come in with any comments. Benita's smiling. I'm wondering if
I think for me, the larger question always is that there's so many different collectives and states and all doing these like pocket works, and that is around system strengthening. And there are survivor collectives, there are things that are happening at different places in different ways. For me, the larger question always like, how do we get all of this together to be a part of a larger movement? And I think it's a larger question, but what I tend to see is there's good work happening in one state and there's a good piece of work happening in another area in another state. And for me, it's like, why aren't we communicating? Why are these two states not coming together with their data, especially with what they've gathered on ground? And why aren't we able to scale that up? So I think it's just food for thought, because every time I'm sitting with this, I feel like the progression of it seems very similar to me from individual to the larger system. But this is the gap that I find myself questioning often.
Yeah, I think, may I also, as I said, I think that's what the higher education institutions and some of the NGOs and other organizations do actually have a responsibility in trying to bring these good practices into one space where other people could actually learn from those good things, actually. Because I think what is actually happening, everybody's actually doing their own little bits, and nobody actually see, rather than reinventing the wheel, how is it that could be collectively promoted is something that should be. And I think that requires a wider discussion. And because of the stigma around the whole thing, and because of the inability of people to actually talk about it in a widely open space, because even in India, people don't even talk about mental health, let alone GBV. So obviously, it's a complex context whereby we should actually have that free conversations around, fearless conversations around GBV. And how the academics, NGOs, and social workers have a great responsibility in making that happen. And then through that open conversations, we can find solutions to these complex issues, because there is no one answer that actually fits a solution.
Anybody else want to comment on that point? It's a really important point, actually, beneath the fragmentation of really good pockets of work taking place. How do we kind of bring those spaces together? It's a difficult one, considering obviously the complex landscape of India and how far-reaching some of these pockets can be. But I think for me personally, I think I'm more of a let's get it out of the institutional discussions. Let's bring it out to the people. Let's push towards agency. Let's do grassroots stuff. Let's get individuals talking. And I think very much back to Raghu's point, which is so important, those fearless conversations. Those need to start happening to normalize the fact that we can and should be talking about these things. And I think it starts from that. It's the cultural shift. It's the kind of shift in the cultural narrative of, these are taboo things. We don't talk about them. It's just a given. It's a, deal with it kind of attitude. We need to get out of those kind of spaces. And I think it comes from a much more democratized, kind of fluid, open space where platforms are then generated. And again, the internet's done a whole host of things. It's enabled a whole plethora of platforms where people can, create and construct and curate their own pieces of information for the audiences that they want to reach out to. So I think there's a huge push, but I think the younger generation as well is a huge, that there is a huge emphasis on kind of them. And it's awful, it sounds like a burden, but kind of carrying that weight of change almost within a South Asian context to say, well, actually, there is a possibility to create these waves of change, really. Nadia, I know you've got your...
Just a small point what you've said about and what Raghu said about this kind of being threatened by these conversations, and for many reasons. You either hold a position of power, or you hold kind of that sensitive experience, or, you know, if we open this can of worms, what if we don't have the time and resources to put them back in or do anything about them? I've had similar conversation about how do we do with, you know, homelessness in the UK. Well, if we don't talk about it, it kind of doesn't exist. So but I think there's also that in an institutional space, and again, speaking from experience, so again, not generalizing, but there's that almost assumption of fragility of individuals that have these experiences in having those conversations. And I think there isn't that acknowledgement necessarily that they have the power, they have the agency, and then they want to talk about it. There's always that kind of gatekeeping and protection. I'm going to cuddle you, I'm going to protect you. We're not going to have this conversation because they're going to be sensitive for you. While actually individuals want to talk and want to share their stories. And I feel like we are in a position of power as institutions with ethics and structures and systems to silence that with better intentions. And I think there needs to be a shift in that to facilitate this kind of work and this kind of to take place and not be afraid of them. But again, that assumptions of fragility, it doesn't sit right with me, because I think these are such resilient, such strong individuals that, yeah, if something doesn't sit right, where is that coming from? Am I too fragile to have those conversations?
Yeah, I think this is a society whereby I think we've seen many examples in our own walks of life where women have actually successfully found a pathway at the end of it. They've seen light and they've actually identified things. And what does the society do? The society, rather than celebrating it, they shun upon them. And I think this is the society that we actually live in. And obviously, there are widespread structures of in India, the Indian Psychological Society, the Indian Social Work Society. Why are they not talking about it? Why are they so adamant on the mental health conditions, not necessarily promoting the kind of wider conversations in society? This is applied psychology in practice. And why are we still relying on the kind of Freudian theories? We should be looking on our own front door and see what is actually happening around us and trying to address that. That is what real psychology should be doing.
We'll drag it into the future, kicking and screaming, Raghu. You're in mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it happens. Probably for good reason. Yeah, I'm just looking at time and I'm conscious of time, but I'm also really pleased with the kind of conversation, I'm sure we all are, that are kind of, you know, being prompted from these discussions, and many more of these conversations need to continue happening. I will plug in information about the next workshop that's going to be taking place. That takes place next Thursday on the 29th of June at the same time, 12 p.m. And that focus will be on creative methods and arts-based interventions. So a real focus on methodologies and how this work and interventions can take place. We've got presentations from Professor Selina Busby from the School of Speech and Drama at the University of London, Dr. Andy Barrett, an artistic director from Excavate, and also Dr. Antonia Ligori, who's from the School of Design and Creative Arts at Loughborough University. They have it's a fantastic creative mix, very well experienced, lots of cases of real life examples of where these individuals have kind of utilized arts-based approaches with communities. So I would strongly encourage you to attend that, but also tell others about it as well. We will share communications with everybody, but I would like to say as well, please, for those of you that have attended today, please do reach out to us. This is a network, and the whole intention really of the network is to expand it and to continue those conversations. So Benita, back to your point of how do we bring all of this together? Well, we start now, and I think really, you know, if you want to, you know, and if you're happy to share your email addresses with Nadia, Raghu, myself and Brown, and then we're happy to sort of have that information, but also share further things that we are doing across the network, across the project, but also future plans for projects and things like that. It'd be really nice to keep in touch with all of you as well. I'm going to pass back to Nadia as PI of the project for any final words.
Thank you, Nick, for sharing. And Benita, I did see an invite from LinkedIn, so we're already connecting. So things are happening. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being such a lovely, lovely audience and engaging in this discussion. Again, we want to talk and we want to create these spaces where we share experience. We're very much learning from you in these discussions as well. I apologize for that. And so thank you very much. I hope to see you all next week. Again, it is fantastic lineup for next week. And yes, thank you very much for your time.